As Ian has alluded to, I think most of the people here, but not everybody, have been following the series that we've been going on in terms of developing spiritual practices and reminding ourselves or introducing ourselves to what those are. We've looked at meditation, we've looked at prayer, we've looked at fasting, we've looked at study, and we've more recently looked at simplicity. And they're all related but different. And I want us to explore today what solitude is and what it isn't, and what we can gain in terms of our walk with God through this practice. So last week, James focused on, in his discussion on solitude, he actually focused on the need for community and contrasting that and seeing how that actually, if you were going to be rewriting a book like The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, perhaps you would have a discipline, a practice of community in 2024, and actually how that is often missing in our lives. And I fully agree with him. But today I want to demonstrate the value of solitude and how that's different from loneliness, which it's often related to. Last week, I wasn't listening to James in person, sat in this room, because this was where I was. I was amongst crowds of people, thousands of people on the streets of London. There was a sense of community. There was a sense of purpose. There was a bravery and a courage amongst the runners that I was cheering on. This is the London Marathon. It's humanity at its best. It's community demonstrated in action. But even those runners, some of them had to go to a very solitary place. Some of them had to really dig deep and find something to get them over the finish line. For everyone, at some point in our lives, regardless of circumstances, whether we're on our own or in a crowd, we feel loneliness. And in my research for doing this talk, I've come across this campaign to end loneliness. And I wanted to just talk into this, as I say, in contrast to what solitude is. And loneliness is something that can hit us, as I say, whether we're in a crowd or whether we're on our own. And there's a campaign to end loneliness. Now, there's a need. When there's a campaign, there's a need. And that's why a campaign is started. And you can see here that 45% of all adults feel lonely at some times. And I think we can probably all concur with this. And some of us would feel that more acutely than others. There is a week to raise awareness of this issue, which is very prevalent in 2024. It's very real, and people feel it more than others, but at all times, we all feel it. And so I love this year's theme, this random acts of connection. And James spoke into this last week. He spoke about some of the things that we can do, some of the ideas around speaking to somebody in the queue next to you, or perhaps sending a WhatsApp message to somebody. Any of these kind of small things, these small acts of connection that can make people's lives a lot better and a lot happier. And I think that's absolutely crucial and something that we can all really benefit from. But I want to contrast what loneliness and solitude is. Outside of the spiritual practice of solitude, there's quite a lot of research and quite a lot of, out in Woman's Hour, for instance, an article last week, somebody speaking about it. There's lots of discussion about why solitude is a positive thing for our well-being. This is a quote from these guys, and it talks about how a state of voluntary aloneness during which personal growth and development and creative activity may take place. Solitude is associated with self-discovery, rest, relaxation, and escapism and happiness. So all really positive things that solitude can bring you. And that's not even adding in a deeply spiritual or a kind of, Jesus isn't quoted or God isn't quoted in that quote there. I mentioned that I was listening to Woman's Hour, and there's a psychologist, Netta Weinstein, who has just written a book called Solitude, The Science and Power of Being Alone. Lots of research on it, lots of evidence that it's really good for your well-being. Now, I appreciate that I'm speaking to a very mixed audience, and it might depend what life stage you're at. You may well be craving time alone. You may well be craving solitude. I'm looking at the young mothers, particularly in the audience here. I very much, hand up, remember locking myself in the toilet just so I could get a moment to myself without a child around my leg. And it also depends on your personality type. Some people really need time on their own. For those of you who are aware of the personality tests and things like that, the idea that if you're an introvert, you process and you recharge and you gain your energy by being on your own. Absolutely crucial. But it's good for us all. And it doesn't need to be over-spiritualized. It's not quite like meditation. We've looked on that earlier on in this series. It's not quite like study. Adults spend a third of their working lifetime alone anyway. So how can we use some of that time better? How can we, just make some positives out of the time that we've got? And I really want to frame solitude in a positive light. As I say, that's why I'm contrasting it at the start of this talk with it's very separate to loneliness. And so, as part of my build-up to talking, I've been trying some things. I've been out walking on my own, and that's something you can really easily do. Not for everybody, but it's something that I personally find to be very valuable. For the first time, I think, in my life, went to the cinema on my own. I think it was a couple of Saturdays ago. And I reflected on why have I not done that before? And I being honest, I think obviously I wasn't like this guy, and I wasn't the only person in the cinema. That would have been sad. Or maybe that would have been a reflection on the movie that I was watching. Actually, I went to watch, it was called Io Capitano, which is about two Senegalese refugees, and it's from their perspective as 16-year-olds. Deeply moving, very harrowing, and I didn't think anybody else would be particularly interested in watching it, so that's partly why I went on my own. But why don't I? I think because there's a bit of a stigma to people thinking I'm sat there on my own, so I haven't got any friends. I think there's an element in, again, depends what life stage you're at, but in indulgence and selfishness on doing something like that on my own, or allowing myself to do a treat like that on my own. So I'm just being vulnerable and honest with you. But I think it's something we can all do so much more and allow ourselves, go for I love a decent coffee. Why don't I do that on my own, in a cafe? So my treats are having a bath. Now, you can't do that. Well, you could, but that's another story. You can't do that without being on your own. And that is a time of real solitude for myself. Some people love gardening. That's a great opportunity. Let's give ourselves permission to do things on our own. I put a picture up here of a daisy because when you're on your own, or even with a young child, actually, I went for a walk with Robin, and we stopped at every daisy. So it wasn't really a walk, actually. But there's something about, taking time. I put a picture there of our youngest son when he was about 19. He is a big advocate of traveling on his own. And he went between college, sixth form college and university. He went traveling, and he did it on his own. And he would say it was the best thing he did because of the opportunity to get to know and get to meet and engage with other people. So there may be some things, and hopefully I'm sparking some ideas in you that you think, actually, I'd love to do that. I was out running with a friend yesterday, and I was talking about what I was doing this weekend and speaking about solitude. And she said, "Oh, Jan, it's my most treasured time of the week. And I carve out time to, even in a household where there are other people, I carve out time just to sit on my own and read." And she likes planning, just plan my schedule, plan my agenda, but on my own. Really valuable time. I'm going on a pilgrimage later this year in October, and I'm going to be doing it with some people. I'm going to be walking the Camino de Santiago, but everything that I've read about the pilgrimage says you find time, even amongst other people, to be on your own and with your own thoughts. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just before I come to that passage, actually, I want to just remind us that it's about being intentional with what we do. So let's look at how and why our best example of who we follow in life, how and why Jesus felt the need to have solitude. Because in everything we do, he is our role model. He is the one who sets the right pattern and the right rhythms for our life. So all of the disciplines and the practices that we're looking at, we're looking to Jesus because he did them. So on this passage, he was incredibly busy. I will just read it, actually. So that evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Gosh, what a busy guy he was. What an incredibly busy life he led. And yet, he got up early in the morning. I am super impressed with the likes of Tim, who get up early in the morning. It's not for me. Tried it, not got the t-shirt. So it's not just about the morning, but it is about carving out time. And I'll talk at the end about how we can perhaps do that. I want to read something from Henry Nouwen. I've been reading quite a few things by him. He does really short books, so it's great. And I want to read what he says about this passage. In the middle of sentences loaded with action, healing suffering people, casting out devils, responding to impatient disciples, traveling from town to town, and preaching from synagogue to synagogue, we find these quiet words. In the center of breathless activities, we hear a restful breathing. In the morning, long before dawn, he got up and left the house and went to a lonely place and prayed there. Surrounded by hours of moving, we find a moment of quiet stillness. In the heart of much involvement, there are words of withdrawal. In the midst of action, there's contemplation. After much togetherness, there's solitude. And the more I read this nearly silent sentence locked in between the loud words of action, the more I have the sense that the secret of Jesus' ministry is hidden in that lonely place where he went to pray early in the morning, long before dawn. In the lonely place, Jesus finds the courage to follow God's will and not his own, to speak God's words and not his own, to do God's work and not by himself. He's constantly reminding us from John 5, verse 30, I can do nothing by myself. My aim is to do not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So it's in this lonely place where Jesus enters intimacy with the Father. And I want to reflect on this place in our lives, somewhere that we know that without a lonely place, our lives are in danger. Somewhere without silence, words lose meaning. That without listening, speaking no longer heals. And that without distance, closeness cannot come. Somewhere we know that without a lonely place, our actions quickly become empty gestures. So that careful balance between silence and words, withdrawal and involvement, distance and closeness, solitude and community, that forms the basis of Christian life and should be something that we think about. So in all the practices that we've talked about, we talk about fasting, not so that we might never eat again. We talk about it because of what it brings to the rest of our lives. And these disciplines are not in and of themselves anything magical, but they bring us to a place where we can hear God and speak for him in a more powerful way. But in 2024, like it or not, we are swept up. The next thing, the next job, the next qualification, that's the book that I've just read that from. We live in a very goal-orientated society, and I am very much in that. We are constantly thinking about where we're going next. What's our next qualification? And can we do well at that? What ladder are we climbing at work, or maybe even amongst, in other circumstances as well. Even how kind are we being, and am I being kind enough, and am I showing enough love, and have I, sometimes I write a to-do list, and that might have really good things on it, like to phone somebody up or to message somebody, but it's, right, I've got to do that. And sometimes reading our Bible is like that. Nothing wrong with the discipline and following a plan, but it can become part of our goal-driven psychology. And then we have worth because of our successes, and we can often be defined by our success. And is that where we find our worth? Our lives can be dominated by superlatives. At work, I'm constantly chasing targets. Maybe amongst our children, we're giving them stars, we're helping them to achieve, we're always trying to get on to the next best thing. When I ran the London Marathon in 2011, I didn't just want to run it, I wanted to be the fastest animal running the London Marathon. I wanted to be the fastest bear. It's always something about being the highest, the strongest, the longest, the fastest. For those of you who want to know, I got beaten by a chicken that year. And that counted as an animal. Where's the justice in that? So how do we recalibrate and find our real worth? We read, and I wrote this down from that fabulous Jireh song. It says, it doesn't take a trophy to make you more proud. So God is saying, you don't need to be the fastest, the strongest, the longest to make God more proud. We don't need those trophies. How do we recalibrate? Well, one way is in those moments of solitude. And in those moments of solitude, that's where we take the mask off. That's where we strip ourselves naked before God. That's where we remind ourselves of God's love, that we're his children, that we're all the truths that we know in the Bible and the words that we've been singing. It's where when we're on our own, it's where we're not comparing ourselves with others. And it's where we're in that silence, we can hear God. And that's putting it on a spiritual level. I mentioned earlier just the value of recalibrating, even in terms of who we are as people, which we know in the context of a loving God. But even if you're looking at solitude from a mental health perspective and in terms of the social circumstances of the world, there is such value in taking off that comparison, taking off that mask. Thomas Merton, an American monk and theologian who died in 1968, said this: "It's in deep solitude that I find the gentleness with which I can truly love my brothers. Solitude and silence teach me to love my brothers for what they are, not for what they say." Yes. Our worth is not the same as our usefulness. And often in life, we think it's about how useful we are, how what have we done, what have we succeeded, what have we produced. And there's a story of a carpenter and his apprentice as they were walking through a large forest. And when they came across a tall, huge, gnarled, old, beautiful tree, the carpenter asked his apprentice, "Do you know why this tree is so tall, so huge, so gnarled, so old, and so beautiful?" And the apprentice looked at his master and said, "No, why?" "Well," the carpenter said, "because it's useless. If it had been useful, it would have been cut down a long time ago and made into tables and chairs. But because it's useless, it could grow so tall and so beautiful that you can sit in its shade and relax." So let's think of ourselves and not be so preoccupied with our usefulness. Let's allow success and failures to lose their power to define us. And let's do that in a place of solitude. I want to just come towards a conclusion to give you a couple of practical things for what you could do. But as I highlighted before, think about what you enjoy. Think about how Jesus used his time of solitude. And if you're somebody who is incredibly busy and you need to find ways to carve out times of solitude. I came across this practice this week. I was in a talk at work, and somebody mentioned this practice, a statio, and it's a monastic practice, and it's about reclaiming those moments between moments, those in-between times, which we all have. It might be a moment between two Zoom meetings. It might be a moment when you're waiting for the kettle to boil. It might be a moment when you've dropped your children off at school. It might be a moment when you've turned your phone off, you've left it downstairs, and before you turn the light off to go to sleep. Let's reclaim them. And a useful little acronym to do in those times is to stop. To stop. To take a breath. Remind ourselves that breath is our life. Breath is what we all have. Breath is given from God, and we can take it, and we can be grateful, and we can be thankful for the breath that we have. And observe how you're feeling without judgment. How are you feeling in your body? How are you feeling in your mind? How are you feeling about yourself? And take off that critical eye and just allow that and acknowledge how you're feeling. And then pray and ask God, as we heard earlier, the verse about trusting in the Lord and leaning on his understanding and praying for our futures and our decisions. And do that from a place of strength, a place where you know that God is with you. So in conclusion, this is the quote about solitude from Richard Foster. Loneliness is inner emptiness, but solitude is inner fulfillment. And it's not first a place, but a state of mind and heart. And it's out of this place that we're effective. As I've said, these disciplines don't achieve anything in themselves, but they line us up to hear what God says about us. They line us up to sense his presence, to hear him better, to listen to him, and to speak to him out of a place of vulnerability and honestness when nobody else is around. My final slide, all of these disciplines take us to a different place. So out of the silence, we're able to speak powerfully. Out of solitude, we're able to practice community in the sense that James reminded us last week. Out of fasting, we're able to appreciate and be so grateful for what we've got. And out of the simplicity that both James and Ian were referring to a couple of weeks ago, we can really reprioritize and work out what are the important things that we need to be doing in life by stripping everything back. So that's kind of what I have to say on solitude. It's been a privilege and a journey for me to just walk into this, to lean into this a little bit more. And I would definitely encourage you all, for those of you who aren't naturally that way inclined, I would encourage you all to find those moments.